I'm Frank Whitty, folks. I guess my claim to fame was primarily the first mayor of Missoula. But before that, I was one of the first people that came into this valley after the Stevens survey. The Stevens survey that Captain Higgins was with was a couple of years before I came through here. But I was born in North Carolina, excuse me, and decided to come west as a young man. And that's just what people did in those days. My folks wanted me to be a school teacher. They were Quakers, and I was pretty bored by that, and so I came to Illinois and got a job clerking in a store. I was pretty good with numbers, and so I clerked for a fellow by the name of Joe Cannon, who later became a very, very powerful Speaker of the United States House of Representatives. And I worked for him for a while, and then that wasn't to my liking, so I went to Kansas for a while. And then I ended up going to Utah, which was one of the worst decisions I think I ever made in my life. But I was young. I was in my early 20s. And I got to Utah right during what they called the Mormon Wars. That was a nasty time because the Mormons didn't trust anybody. They thought the government was trying to pretty much shut them down. And so if you weren't Mormon, you were in trouble. And I was sick, and I was broke, and I was pretending to be a Mormon. And, you know, I had this southern accent. And, but anyway, I decided I had to get out of there some way. And I heard about this fellow named Van Etten, who was he had a team of oxen, and he was going to haul goods up north to this place called Montana Territory. So I hired on, and it was a hellacious trip over the mountains with those oxen and coming down into the Bitterroot Valley, that steep, steep pass. Never gone so fast down a mountain with oxen in front of us trying to dig in, and we thought we were all going to be killed. We came in and we left some of our goods at Fort Owen, which is by Stevensville now. John Owen was managing that. And I came into the Hellgate Valley, and I saw what I counted to be approximately 300 Indian teepees that were here. They weren't hostiles. They were friendly Salish, and they were here to trade. So, I mean, I never forgot that. This is a trading center. This is a natural area where 5 valleys come together. And so I decided I was going to stay here and become a farmer. So I planted a crop of vegetables, and things were going good until August, when I learned about Montana summers, and we had a killing frost come through. So I lost my entire crop. It all turned black. Convinced me that I was not cut out to be a farmer. So I decided I better go get a job, and I went to Fort Walla Walla, Washington, which was the next fort. And that's where I met Captain Higgins and Francis Warden. They were in business together. They had a store there, so they hired me as their clerk. So we would kind of sit around, Higgins and I, and talk about this Hellgate Valley and about all the opportunities there might be here if there was a road here. There was just a trail through here, a pack trail. And but in 1860, John Mullen was hired by the government, Captain John Mullen, to build a road through here to connect Fort Walla Walla with Fort Benton, so that you had Fort Walla Walla was on the Columbia River, Fort Benton was on the Missouri, so your goods could come both ways from that. So that same summer, when Mullen was building his road through here, the 3 of us, Higgins, Warden, and myself, came here and built what we called Warden's store, or Higgins Warden's store, at a place called Hellgate, which was about 4 miles west of downtown Missoula, or a couple miles west of Reserve and Mullen Road. And that was pretty close to where the original Mullen Road is. So we started up, and it was a very rough place, this Hellgate. It lived up to its name. Hellgate had gotten its name from the canyon because there were the Salish and the Nez Perce would come through here together, and they would go to the buffalo hunting grounds east of the Continental Divide and harvest the buffalo and bring them back here. And the Blackfeet, who claimed the buffalo as their own because they happened to live in that area, would ambush them in this canyon up here. And French trappers came through, and they saw all of these Indian bones strewn along there, along the river there, and the one commented it looked like we're at the gates of hell, or I'd rather go through the gates of hell than try to go through there if I'm going to get massacred. So that name stuck for this whole valley, and so we called our little settlement Hellgate. And it was a tough time. There wasn't any law and order up here. You know, there were some rough characters here, and I always had a friend by the name of Granville Stewart. And Granville Stewart, he was prospecting over by a place that became called Gold Creek, or American Creek at that time. But we became friends, and I was always looking for gold too, even though I was a clerk. The clerk wasn't exciting enough, and you always wanted to write home and say, you know, I've found gold, I've struck it rich, because my parents were not happy to see me go out west. But you know, you have to realize too that the Civil War was raging during those times, and that's why a lot of the people were up here. They were, you know, didn't want to be involved in that bloody conflict. And so everybody seemed to have their hand in some sort of gold claim, myself included. I was riding with Granville Stewart once to Gold Creek, and these two fellows came up on us, and they asked if they could ride along with us, and we said sure. And they were very charming fellows. The one especially was well dressed and seemed to be well educated. And so we had camp with them that night, and we rode along with them the next day. And one thing that we found a little curious was that they always wanted to lag a little bit behind us. They always wanted to be in back of us. And we wondered about that. Well, they gave us their names and didn't mean anything to us. About 6 weeks later, we found out that one of them was named Henry Plummer. And he didn't tell us that, but he was sheriff of that Bannock, Virginia City area, and a group called the Vigilantes formed because there really wasn't any law and order, and there were all of these holdups and murders that were happening. And one of the outlaws that they captured said, well, Sheriff Plummer is the fellow that's ahead of all of this. So they got Sheriff Plummer, and they hanged him, gave him a short trial. Well, back to Hellgate, we had some tough-looking characters come in here, and in December of one year, all of these vigilante horsemen came riding in, and my gosh, it was quite a scene. And they came up and they grabbed this guy by the name of Skinner, and they took him and they gave him a trial, and the trials were very short because they were the judge and the jury, the vigilantes, and they would say, how do you plead? And the fellow would say, I'm innocent. And then they would say, aha, we know that I'm innocent is the secret code word that the highwaymen use. So you're obviously guilty. So it was pretty much a lose-lose situation for these guys that were accused. If you were accused, you know, you were going to hang, basically. And so it was kind of like the Salem witch trials, you know, where they put the woman out on the water, and if she floated, she was a witch, and she was put to death. And if she sank, of course, you know, same thing. Well, I guess we made a mistake with that one, but she looked suspicious anyway. So it's kind of the same way with the vigilantes, but we were actually grateful to see these thugs go. And then we started talking about it, and we knew that Skinner used to come over and he hung out in the Hellgate in the warden's store around the safe all the time. And his tough buddies would come in there too, and they'd always want to be by the safe, and they, you know, sometimes they'd be patting that safe on the top, and we had a lot of gold in there, a lot of gold dust, because we were getting it There were strikes both east and west by that time, and we figured that they were probably going to rob that safe and murder us all, because that's usually what they did. They usually left no witnesses. So we were grateful that the Vigilantes had come through here, and they hanged 4 or 5 people in this immediate area, one up at Stevensville area. And a little bit later, we decided that we needed to have some water that flowed all summer long to power a mill. We needed a flour mill. People were starting to move in here, and a lumber mill. Grant Creek, which is the closest creek, kind of dried up in the summertime, so that was no good. So we looked east, and the next one was Rattlesnake Creek, and that was a good, strong creek that ran all summer long. The only problem is there was a fellow named Hamilton that owned that land right around Rattlesnake Creek, where the mouth of Rattlesnake came into the Clark Fork, or the Hellgate, as we called it then. And he had a little, what he called a trading post. It was mainly a place where he sold whiskey to the Indians. And, but he would not sell us the land, so we had to dig this canal or ditch from Rattlesnake all the way to where we built the mill. David Patty built the mill, and it was right about where that new bank is down there on Higgins and Front Street. Right in that area is where we built our mill. So we had that ditch going all the way, you know, down by, what's that called, the Doubletree or whatever. And you can still see part of the bricks in the building where that business called the Trailhead is. If you go there and you go downstairs, you can see these arches on both ends where that ditch ran through under that building. But we powered the mill, and it became known as Missoula Mills, and people started moving in from Hellgate. Within about 5 years, Hellgate was pretty much a ghost town, and Missoula Mills was on its way. Our main business was thriving, our commercial business, because miners were coming through here and they needed supplies, and they also needed, you know, whiskey and things like that. And anyway, but you know, Missoula just didn't go very fast at all. We were about 400 people, and there was the rumor that the railroad was going to come through here. We knew they were, the Northern Pacific. So we sent representatives, you know, and the railroad pretty much would say, "What will you give us?" And they would come here. We sent McCormick over to talk with them, because he was kind of a pretty good negotiator. And you know, they would say, "Well, you know, we don't know about this place here. It looks pretty good at this place that well, these French settled down here. We may put our main shops there, bypass you." And of course, then we would have a little confab, and we'd come back and say, "We've got to give them more lots." So we'd give them more and more lots, and we ended up giving the railroad choice lots all over Missoula. And A.J. Erlin, who owned all of the property from the railroad tracks up to the North Hills, where he had his ranch, he gave them a tremendous amount of land, and so did Higgins, Captain Higgins. Well, Higgins thought that he was going to get the contract for the railroad ties, and a fellow by the name of A.B. Hammond made an end run around Higgins, and he got the contract, and that was the beginning of the Missoula mercantile business that Higgins was furious about, because he had given up all this land and got virtually nothing in return. But I was a clerk in Higgins' store until the railroad came through. When it did, it was a joyous day. I got out this keg of whiskey that I'd been saving, and we had a big party downtown. And the fine people of Missoula elected me mayor that same year, in 1883. I served as mayor. After that, I was elected judge, and I was a judge the rest of my life. And I lived a long life. I met Elizabeth Countryman, and we were married for, you probably have to ask her, but I believe it was 40, you know, 45, 42. A typical man, you know. It was a good marriage. And we had a tremendous, everything seemed to go right for me in my career. I helped form the State Historical Society. I went to Helena to lobby for us to get the university here. I took all kinds of whiskey and cigars to kind of, you know, lubricate the wheels of the legislature, and we succeeded in that. And but for poor Elizabeth, child after child only lived a few months or a year or so, and so we had all of those tragedies of these stones that you see here until Frank Jr. was born, and Frank survived, and he eventually went into law practice with me, which is a proud day for me. I lived until 1916, and I became the longest living resident of Missoula at that time. I was very well known. When I decided to pass over, they had a funeral that started down on Higgins and Cedar Street. Cedar Street is what we call Broadway now, but we had cedar water pipes running under it, so we called it Cedar then. And the Masonic band was there, all the businesses in town closed, and they filed a procession that took my coffin and myself, of course, I was in there, down for a ride to what's called Orange Street now, which was Harris at that time, and then we took a right and we went to my house, which was somewhat of a mansion. It was a columned home that looks like something you would see in North Carolina. It was a very beautiful house, somewhat similar to Dixon's house that's in the East Pine Street Historic District. That's the Knights of Columbus now, with those big columns. And that was located right across from St. Francis Church, which is, I believe there's a business called Tiorama there. A business went in there after they tore down my home after I was gone, my beautiful home. But anyway, it was quite a funeral, and they had the proceedings in my house, and then they went block east and took me down what would become Woody Street across the tracks, because the tracks did not go through, you know, like they do now on Orange Street. They dead-ended at the railroad. So they took me down Woody and then brought me out here to my resting place that I was satisfied resting until, you know, a couple years ago, when I decided I wanted to talk about a few things and tell these stories. So I decided to make another appearance. And you know, and then I heard about this group called the Rolling Stones, and they've been touring almost as long as I have. So, figured I could do it, and I just figured I actually look better than that Keith Richards guy. I look more alive than he does. So. Anyway,
you're more well prepared.
Yeah, I think I maybe am. Maybe I hadn't used some of the substances that he did. But I'd like to answer any questions you might have, and if you don't, enjoy this wonderful, wonderful day. We really lucked out on this one, and there's Captain Higgins is down that way. Mrs. Warden is right down here. Mary Guaman, the infamous madam, is over there, which is my nemesis. I sentenced her to 14 years of hard labor at the state penitentiary, and that's kind of a long story. But I tell the true story, you'll get a totally different story from her. But she ran houses, boarding houses, they call them, female boarding houses, along Front Street, and she didn't like competition, so she had competition from this fellow by the name of Bobby Burns, Robert Burns, and he owned a couple of houses, and so she didn't like competition, and she hired a couple of soldiers to dynamite his house with him in it. She went to San Francisco to establish an alibi, and they dynamited the house, but Bobby Burns wasn't in it, and he survived. And these guys, having the intelligence of most criminals, went down to the bar and, with the money they had been paid, and proceeded to brag about blowing up Bobby Burns' house, and were arrested and proceeded to squeal on Mary Guaman. They brought her back here, and she went to trial, and the prosecuting attorney was by the name of Joseph Dixon, who would later make a distinguished career as governor and senator and campaign assistant to Teddy Roosevelt, and quite a career. He was a prosecuting attorney, and you know, I with hindsight, you know, hindsight is 20/20, and I realized that I let Dixon bring up too many bad things about Mary Guaman that had nothing to do with the attempted murder of Bobby Burns in this trial. Did I mention that he was a shirt-tail relation of mine, Dixon? Yeah, I had given him a job when he first came out here, so you know, that might have clouded my judgment a little bit. But she was found guilty, sentenced to 14 years, and we thought we were done with her. But Mary had some of the finest legal representation in Montana. It was rumored that she had put some of these lawyers through law school. And they took it all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled in her favor, overturned my ruling, and chastised me rightly, I realized afterwards. I had let him poison the well until, you know, as many bad things as he knew about her, he certainly hadn't told all of the bad things about her. So she was set free. She had a tough time when she was in prison. She was stabbed while she was there. Survived. Came back in triumph, saying, you know, Judge Woody, you can't beat me. And so we were not friends after that. And, you know, shortly after that, she beat up one of the ladies, one of the soiled doves of the time, called French Emma. Just beat her to a pulp along Front Street. And she was tried for that, but you know, just got a fine. She had a lot of people intimidated in this town. She was quite the lady. Now, I rode on a stagecoach with her in that homecoming parade, 2.5 hours in the cold, so we actually did get to come to some sort of an understanding about certain things that we didn't realize at the time were happening, and it could have had something to do with that little bottle of Canadian Mist that somebody handed us to take the chill off, because it was certainly needed it that day. That was a cold day. But I'd like to thank you folks for coming out, and,
Thank you.
and come again. Welcome.